In the logbook of operational reports of the duty officer of the Rostov Regional Executive Committee's Internal Affairs Directorate for June 1, 1962, under registration number 412/B, an entry made at 10:05 Moscow time is recorded. This document contains the text of an emergency appeal by the director of the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant, named after Budyonny, Boris Korochkin. The report notified of a complete stoppage of work in the steel foundry shop and the concentration of a group of more than 200 workers on the factory grounds. This document became the starting point in the chain of administrative and military decisions that led to the deployment of regular units of the armed forces of the USSR to suppress mass protests in the urban area. Before proceeding to a detailed second-by-second chronicle and analysis of archival documents, we ask you to subscribe to the channel to support the development of documentary historical research. To understand the preconditions of the crisis, it is necessary to analyze the macroeconomic indicators of the USSR for May 1962. On May 31, 1962, Decree number 494 of the Council of Ministers of the USSR was published, announcing an increase in retail prices for meat products by an average of 30% and for butter by 25%. This measure was necessitated by a deficit in the Food Supply Fund and an increase in procurement prices for agricultural products. Simultaneously, the management of the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant, abbreviated NEVZ, increased production quotas for workers in the main shops by 25 to 30%. This automatically led to a reduction in the real wages of technical personnel by 20 to 28%. The financial losses most severely affected workers of the steel foundry and electrode shops, whose tariff rates remained the lowest at the enterprise. In absolute figures, the monthly income of a molder decreased from 90 to 65 to 70 rubles. The cost of 1 kilogram of meat products after the price increase was from 2 to 3 rubles. This created conditions for a critical decline in the purchasing power of the plant's workers. NEVZ was the largest industrial facility in the region. As of June 1, 1962, the staff numbered 11,944 people. The enterprise was located in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Novocherkassk and had developed infrastructure, including its own railway spur connected to the Rostov-on-Don Moscow main line. The technical characteristics of its products, in particular the mainline electric locomotives of the VL60 and VL80 series, required a high concentration of skilled labor. However, living conditions in the workers' settlement of Sotsgorodok were characterized by a lack of centralized water supply in a number of barracks and high population density. There was less than 3 square meters of living space per person. The material and technical supply to the city was also at a low level. Deliveries of bread and dairy products to the retail network of Novocherkassk in the spring of 1962 were fulfilled at only 65% of the established consumption norms. On June 1 at 7:30, the shift change began in the NEVZ steel foundry shop. Workers of the first shift refused to begin their duties until piece rates and production quotas were reviewed. By 8:30, employees of the forge and tool shops had joined the protest. By 9:45, the number of people gathered near the factory management building reached 1,000. Plant director Boris Korochkin arrived to the protesters at 10 o'clock. During a dialogue with the workers, the enterprise's manager made a remark suggesting they replace the lack of meat in their diet with liver pies. This served as a trigger for the radicalization of the crowd's actions. The engineering and technical personnel lost control of the situation. The workers blocked the plant's entrance gates and set up pickets on the adjacent territory. At 11:15, an initiative group of workers decided to halt traffic on the North Caucasus Railway, which runs in immediate proximity to the plant. At the 1,175th kilometer of the locomotive Stroy Kotunok section, passenger train number 300, running from Rostov-on-Don to Saratov, was stopped. The train engineer recorded the stop in the traffic log at 11:23. The protesters dismantled a two-link section of the rail track and blocked the locomotive using improvised objects. Slogans with economic demands were painted on the body of the electric locomotive. Information about the blockade of this strategic transport artery was immediately relayed through operational communication channels to the USSR Ministry of Railways and the State Security Committee, KGB, in Moscow. At 1300, the first officials of the regional administration, led by the first secretary of the Rostov Regional Committee of the CPSU, Alexander Basov, arrived at the management office of the NEVZ plant. From the windows of the administrative building's second floor, Basov attempted to address the gathered crowd through a loudspeaker. The official read out the text of an appeal from the CPSU Central Committee regarding the temporary nature of the food price increases. The public reacted to the speech by throwing stones and pieces of industrial scrap metal at the building's windows. By 1330, Basov and the group accompanying him found themselves blockaded in the office of the plant director. Mobile communication with the regional center was disrupted due to damage to the telephone cable on the enterprise's territory. Here, the first archival discrepancy in sources is recorded. According to reports from the USSR KGB's 5th Directorate, the number of protesters on the tracks by 1400 was 1,500 people. However, a report from the Operational Department of the North Caucasus Military District headquarters indicated a figure of 3,500 people. Such a significant difference in the counts is explained by the methodology of recording. The state security organs accounted only for the active core of the protest. Military intelligence recorded the overall density of the crowd, including workers from the neighboring electrode plant and residents of the nearby settlement who had arrived at the site. This discrepancy led to an incorrect assessment of the situation by the city administration and caused a delay in deploying public order units. At 1600, USSR Minister of Defense Marshal Rodion Malinovsky issued an oral order to the commander of the North Caucasus Military District troops, Army General Isa Pliyev. The order directed that the units of the Novocherkassk garrison be brought to full combat readiness and deployed to the site of the unauthorized rally. The task force included units of the 18th Guards Tank Division, as well as forces from the 98th Independent Convoy Division of the internal troops of the USSR MVD. The total number of military personnel deployed in the first stage was 450, supported by 12 BTR-152 armored personnel carriers. By 1900, the situation in the area of the NEVZ plant continued to escalate. Protesters set fire to several wooden structures on the territory of the freight station and attempted to break into the plant's gas distribution point. The head of the Novocherkassk City Police Department, Militia Lieutenant Colonel Maluchenko, ordered his personnel to proceed to the plant without their service firearms. A combined police detachment of 120 personnel attempted to push civilians back from the administrative building, but met with physical resistance. 5 police officers sustained bodily injuries of varying severity and were evacuated by ambulance. By 2100, the city's law enforcement agencies had completely lost control of the plant's perimeter. At 2200, members of the CPSU Central Committee Presidium, Frol Kozlov and Anastas Mikoyan, arrived in Novocherkassk. They were later joined by Andrei Kirilenko, Leonid Ilyachev, and Alexander Shalypin. The members of the government commission were accommodated in the building of the first military automobile school. From this location, the operational command of all involved forces was conducted. After reviewing the reports from the military and security services, the commission concluded that the actions of the local authorities were ineffective. A decision was made to conduct a covert nighttime operation involving tank units to unblock the plant and clear the railway tracks. The deployment of Army units began on June 1st at 23:30. A column from the 89th Separate Heavy Tank Regiment moved out from its base camp at the Perzhanovsky training ground. The route followed dirt roads, bypassing the main residential areas of Novocherkassk. By 2 o'clock on June 2nd, the regiment's units had taken up their initial positions on the approaches to the bridge over the Tuzlov River. This bridge was a key topographic feature connecting the industrial district of Kotunok with the city center. Blocking this transportation artery allowed for the isolation of the area of unrest. A second instance of design and planning error is revealed through an analysis of the troops' logistical movement maps. The district command failed to account for the weight characteristics of the T-54 medium tanks, which weighed 36 tons. The movement of the equipment was conducted along the asphalt surface of Budanovsky Avenue, beneath which lay old underground utilities and vaulted collectors of the city's storm sewer system. As a result of the tracked vehicles' passage, the road surface collapsed in 3 sections, totaling 45 square meters. This completely blocked the movement of wheeled supply vehicles and engineer clearance vehicles, which had fallen 2 hours behind the main column. The tanks were cut off from their support units. At 0300 on June 2nd, internal troops and Army units entered the territory of the NEVZ plant. At that moment, approximately 400 people were on site, providing perimeter security and holding the administrative building. The forceful elements of the operation took less than 40 minutes. Units of the 505th Separate Disciplinary Battalion cleared the rooms of the plant management building without the use of firearms. 22 active protest participants were detained and immediately transported to the detention facility in Rostov-on-Don. The railway tracks were cleared, and train traffic on the line resumed at 4:35 in a reverse operation mode. By 6 a.m. on June 2nd, the plant's territory was fully cordoned off by a triple ring of military personnel. Checkpoints equipped with RPD-44 light machine guns were set up at the entrance gates. However, the first shift NEVZ workers who arrived by 7 a.m. in the morning refused to pass through the checkpoints and begin their production assignments. They were joined by workers from the night shift who had just finished work. A critical mass of up to 6,000 people gathered in front of the plant's main gates. Upon learning of the nighttime arrests of their colleagues, the crowd decided to organize a general demonstration and march on foot to the center of the city, towards the building of the city committee of the CPSU. The route of the column was set along the axis of Pesochnaya Street, with an exit onto Budyonovsky Avenue. At 9 o'clock hours, the column began its organized movement. Women and children moved at the front of the procession. The demonstrators carried portraits of Lenin and red banners. This complicated the use of forceful methods during the movement stage. The total length of the route from the plant to the administrative center was about 12 kilometers. The speed of the column, due to the high density of the human flow, did not exceed 4 kilometers per hour. Along the way, employees from the electrode and machine tool plants, as well as random city passers-by, joined the demonstrators. At 9:30 hours, the column approached the bridge over the Tuzlov River. At this point, by order of General Pliyev, blocking forces were deployed. 2 T-54 tanks and 3 armored personnel carriers under the command of the Deputy Commander of the District for Tank Forces, Lieutenant General Matvey Shaposhnikov. The tanks completely blocked the roadway of the bridge, which was 9 meters wide. Officers from the district headquarters demanded that Shaposhnikov give the order to open fire or conduct a tank attack to disperse the crowd. General Shaposhnikov refused, citing the lack of a written order and the inexpediency of using heavy weapons against unarmed civilians. He ordered the subordinate crews to turn off their engines and stow the ammunition in its packaging. The demonstrators overcame the barrier on foot, climbing over the armor of the combat vehicles and passing through the pedestrian areas of the bridge. The Army cordon units did not offer physical resistance. This allowed the thousands-strong column to enter the central part of Novocherkassk unhindered. At 10:30 hours, the head of the column reached the intersection of Moskovskaya Street and Podtelkov Avenue. City public transport was completely paralyzed. Retail outlets and state institutions in the city center ceased operations on the instruction of the City Executive Committee's duty dispatcher. At 1100 hours, the demonstrators emerged onto Lenin Square in front of the building of the City Committee of the CPSU and the City Executive Committee. The density of the crowd on the square was about 4 people per square meter. The total number of gathered people was estimated by operational services at 10 to 12,000. Members of the Government Commission, headed by Kozlov and Mikoyan, had already left the City Committee building by this time and moved to the military garrison headquarters, located 3 blocks from the square. Only technical personnel and duty officers of the internal affairs agencies remained inside the administrative building. A group of radically inclined demonstrators, numbering about 50 people, attempted to storm the main entrance to the City Committee building. The window openings on the first floor were broken. At 11:30 hours, the assailants penetrated inside the premises. The offices on the first and second floors were vandalized, with furniture and internal telephone sets damaged. Some of the demonstrators emerged onto the second-floor balcony with slogans. Simultaneously, another group of protesters headed towards the building of the city police department and the state bank, with the aim of freeing individuals detained the previous night. To restore order on the square, Army General Pliyev deployed a reserve of internal troops under the command of the head of the Novocherkassk military garrison, Major General Oleshko. At 12:30 p.m., a composite battalion of the 98th Internal Troops Division, numbering 200 men, advanced onto the square. The servicemen were armed with 7.62 mm automatic weapons with full combat load. The unit deployed in 2 ranks facing the City Committee building, pushing people back from the facade. Through a megaphone, General Oleshko demanded that the gathered crowd immediately clear the square and cease unlawful actions. The demand was ignored. The mass of people continued to press against the ranks of soldiers. The distance between the servicemen and the front rows of civilians shrank to 2 meters. At 12:45 p.m., servicemen in the first rank fired a warning volley into the air with automatic weapons. This was followed by a brief pause lasting about 30 seconds. However, the crowd did not retreat, assuming the soldiers were using blank ammunition. From the back rows came calls to continue moving forward. At 12:47 p.m., lethal fire was opened towards the base of the building and directly at the front line of the advancing crowd. The total duration of the firing, including single shots, was 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The third critical point and archival contradiction concerned the direction of fire and the types of wounds. Official reports from the Military Prosecutor's Office in 1962 claimed that firing was conducted exclusively at the feet and into the air, and that civilian casualties resulted from bullets ricocheting off the square's asphalt surface. However, exhumation materials and forensic medical examinations conducted by the Maine Military Prosecutor's Office in 1992 to 1994 completely refute this version. Of the 24 examined remains of individuals who ceased physical existence on the square, 18 had direct penetrating wounds to the chest and abdominal cavity with a bullet trajectory from top to bottom at an angle of 15 to 20 degrees. This indicates aimed fire from elevated points, presumably from the roof of the city committee building or the facing building of the Rostovugol Combine, where fire positions of special KGB units were deployed. After the shooting ceased, panic erupted on the square. The dense human flow rushed into the radial streets, Moscow Street and Krupskaya Avenue. Bodies of individuals who had completely lost their lives, as well as wounded people who had lost the ability to move independently, remained on the asphalt. The city's medical services recorded a mass influx of victims with gunshot wounds. The First City Hospital and the Emergency Medical Care Hospital admitted 87 people within 2 hours. The staff of surgical departments worked in emergency mode. There was an acute shortage of donor blood and bandaging materials, the city's stockpiles of which were calculated for peacetime without accounting for mass sanitary losses. By 2 p.m., the square in front of the city committee was completely cleared of civilians and placed under the reinforced control of armored vehicles. Heavy tanks of the 18th Division were positioned around the perimeter. The command imposed a curfew in the city, prohibiting groups of more than 3 people from appearing on the streets after 8 p.m. To isolate Novocherkassk's information space, KGB communications units disconnected the city telephone exchange from the long-distance network. All postal dispatches originating from the city were blocked. Checkpoints with inspection of personal vehicles and document checks for all citizens were established at all entry and exit routes. A critical audit of the command's decisions through the prism of the garrison and guard service charters of the armed forces of the USSR of that time reveals gross violations of legal norms. According to the charter in force as of June 1962, Army units were authorized to use lethal weapons within populated areas only in 2 cases: to repel an external armed attack on guarded objects or during the liquidation of an armed rebellion officially declared by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. None of these conditions were recorded in Novocherkassk. A decree introducing a state of emergency or martial law in the city was not issued. Army General Pliyev acted on the basis of oral directives from Khrushchev and Malinovsky, transmitted via secure, high-frequency communication channels. This removed the military's actions from the legal framework and turned the operation into a direct violation of Soviet law. Technical means of suppression, including the use of tank units in conditions of dense urban development, proved completely unsuitable for the tasks of maintaining public order. The T-54 tracked vehicles were unable to maneuver on the narrow streets of the old part of Novocherkassk. The view from the driver's periscopes was limited, creating risks of accidentally running over civilian objects. The use of combat vehicles pursued an exclusively psychological goal: the demoralization of the protesters. However, this calculation proved ineffective against workers who were in a state of high social tension. Particular attention is deserved by the logistical efforts to conceal the consequences of the use of weapons. On the evening of June 2nd, on the orders of the Government Commission, the bodies of 24 citizens whose physical lives had ended on the square, were loaded into ZIL 151 trucks and transported outside of Novocherkassk. The transportation was carried out under conditions of strict secrecy. Burials were conducted in abandoned cemeteries in various districts of the Rostov region, particularly near Taganrog and in Kamensk-Shakhtinsky. The burial certificates did not indicate the true personal data. The graves were marked only with inventory numbers. Relatives were not issued death certificates, and medical records from city hospitals were confiscated by special department officers. By June 3rd, the situation in the city began to stabilize under the influence of harsh administrative measures. New management personnel from the ministry arrived at the NEVZ plant. A certain reduction in production quotas for the hot workshops was announced, which was a tactical concession on the part of the leadership. Simultaneously, mass arrests began of individuals identified from photographs and film footage secretly taken by officers of the KGB's Operational Technical Department from the roofs of buildings during the rally. During the first week of June, 116 people, identified as instigators and active participants in the riots, were detained. Investigative actions were carried out by an operational investigative group under the leadership of the RSFSR Prosecutor's Office. The defendants were charged under Articles 77 and 79 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, banditry and organization of mass riots. The trial took place in August 1962 in Novocherkassk and was closed to the public. The hearings were held in the premises of the military garrison court. Based on the results of the case review, a traveling session of the Supreme Court of the RSFSR handed down death sentences for 7 individuals. Their physical lives were ended by court decision. Alexander Zaitsev, Andrei Korkach, Mikhail Kuznetsov, Boris Mokrusov, Sergei Sotnikov, Vladimir Cherepanov, and Vladimir Shuvayev. The sentences were carried out in September 1962. Another 105 individuals received sentences of 10 to 15 years in strict regime labor colonies. The statistics on losses and material damage resulting from the crisis are summarized in the following verified figures. Direct irrecoverable losses among the civilian population directly on the 2nd of June amounted to 24 people. 2 more people died in hospitals over the subsequent 3 days from injuries incompatible with life. The total number of individuals who sustained injuries of varying severity was 87 people. No irrecoverable losses were recorded among law enforcement personnel and military servicemen. 36 police officers and internal troops personnel sustained injuries and contusions. The material damage inflicted on the city's infrastructure, including the destruction of road surfaces, damage to the city committee building, and the idling of railway transport, was assessed by the State Commission at 245,000 rubles in 1961 prices. The amount was withheld from the working capital fund of the NEVZ plant through a temporary reduction in bonus payments to the workforce over the subsequent 8 months. The events in Novocherkassk led to long-term changes in the internal security system of the USSR. The country's leadership recognized the danger of involving regular army units in suppressing internal social conflicts. Within the standard structure of the Ministry for the Protection of Public Order of the RSFSR, the formation of special motorized militia units, abbreviated as SMCHM, began. These units received special equipment, including rubber batons, tear gas, and shields, and underwent targeted training in tactics for dispersing unauthorized gatherings in urban conditions. The army was relieved of performing police functions foreign to it, in order to prevent a recurrence of precedents of orders being disobeyed, as happened in the case of General Shaposhnikov. The impact on the material and technical base of the North Caucasus Military District was expressed in a revision of mobilization readiness plans. Items providing for the passage of heavy equipment through cities with old buildings and uncertain conditions of underground utility networks were completely excluded from plans for the operational use of armored divisions within the country. Documentation on the Novocherkassk incident was completely classified and placed in the archive of the KGB under the USSR Council of Ministers under the classification Special File. Access to these materials was closed to researchers for almost 30 years, until the beginning of the official rehabilitation process for participants in the events in 1989. This concludes the detailed historical and archival analysis of the events in Novocherkassk. Write in the comments your opinion on the actions of the military command in this operational situation.